Okay, great. Our session is called No Stupid Questions. It's inspired by this podcast that's really popular. I don't know if you've had a chance to engage with it earlier. By this excellent researcher called Angela Duckworth. And we're going to try our best to just have a conversation amongst the both of us and with all of you as well. So there's no real plan for this except to just maybe explore the idea of what it means to follow your gut and your intuition. What does that even mean? How does that fit into the work that we do? What are times in which your gut shouldn't be trusted? And we also kind of look at some research across different disciplines. And just see where we reach. So there's no intended conclusion from this, and it's meant to be participatory. Please don't wait for a cue to chime in. If there's any point in which you feel like you want to share a thought or an idea or just your perspective, please just interrupt us and feel free to just add your 2 cents to it. I'm going to open my notes because I've terrible memory. All right. So we're talking about intuition today. What does intuition mean? Is it a feeling? Is it a type of cognition? Sometimes you just know things about things and you don't know how you know it. And we call that a gut feeling and we call that an intuition. But where does it come from? And how do we know whether to trust it? So that's what we're going to go into today. To begin, we thought it might be good to start at the beginning with our childhoods. So, right when we were infants and we were babies, right? Are we born with an innate sense of right or wrong? Like, as babies, do we know what's good and what's bad? Do we know what's right and what's wrong and what to do? And there's been a lot of debate about this for a very, very, very long time. So let's ask a new parent over here, Patrick.
Putting me on the
is-
spot.
Yeah, Patrick. I mean, that's the whole point. Patrick is now a proud father of a 9-month-old baby. So, Patrick, what do you think? Does Khalil already have a sense of justice? Does he know the difference between right or wrong?
I think Khalil knows when he's hungry. He knows when he's tired. He knows when he wants his parents. He'll stand up and be very insistent that I take care of him right now. But whether that's right or wrong, I mean, I don't think he has that sense. Just more about like whether daddy's there.
All right, let's see what the research says. So, at the Yale University, there's this lab called the Baby Center, or a little fancy term for it is the Infant Cognition Center, led by this researcher called Karen Wynn. And for the last decade or so, she and her team have been essentially exploring whether babies are born with a sense of justice, whether they know the difference between good and bad. So let's talk a little bit about this experiment that they've been running. So, different ages between literally from infancy to 24 years of age are exposed to a little show, like a little puppet show, in which there are two bunnies, and they're the stars of the show, right? So one bunny is walking along and comes across this other bunny that's trying to open a box. This bunny looks at the other bunny and helps him open a box and then walks away. Now another bunny shows up, and let's say the first bunny was in green and the second bunny is in orange. Now the bunny in orange walks up, sees this other bunny struggling, slams the box shut, and just walks away. And the babies are shown this puppet show. Then these two bunnies, the one in orange and the one in green, so the one in green was helpful and the one in orange was not so helpful. It's actually kind of mean. So both these bunnies are brought to this baby and they're basically placed in front of the baby, and the baby is going to select which bunny that they like. So different ways to do this: they reach out and they pick up the bunny that they like. And the mama who's sitting with the baby is asked to basically close her eyes, no body language, so they're not providing cues as to which bunny they would prefer, because that would influence the baby's decision. In their study, they found that over 90% of the babies that were in the study were actually more prone to pick up the good bunny, or the bunny in green. And this has led them to believe that even as infants, we're born with a sense of good and bad. And that's actually been corroborated across a bunch of different research in early childhood development where kids actually tend to, as early as 3 years of age and even 2 years of age, they're going to reach out and they're going to actually judge people on whether they're good people or bad people. If somebody is a good role model or a bad role model, as early as 2 years of age before they can even start speaking. So perhaps research suggests that we are born with an innate sense of justice and we know what's good and bad. And that could be our gut feeling, right? That's our intuition, that we intuitively know what is right and what is wrong since the day we were born. So what changes along the way? How do we grow up to have different types of intuitions almost about the same situations? And that's what we're going to explore in the next bit.
Well, I guess Anushka knows more about my son than I do. So I obviously am not as well versed in child development research as Anushka, but I wanted to tackle this from a different angle. Most of the research that I'm familiar with is with adults, but my specialty is actually research about research. The angle that I wanted to take was about people's intuitions about research and whether they're correct or not. So one of the trends that's occurred recently in the past couple decades is we now have a whole set of researchers who have taken past findings in research and done new studies just to see, okay, do you get the same results? And the idea is that if you do the study very rigorously that second time, and maybe you have more people involved, it can serve as a confirmation or not of the past finding. And so the question is, if you have a set of these replications where you're taking one finding and then seeing, okay, do you get the same result if you do the study again very rigorously? Can people predict which results will replicate or not? Which results will hold up to that confirmation or not? People can. So we know that researchers can predict this in advance. But you can ask an even more fundamental question. So, generally, we're all doing behavioral science research. We all are people. And we need to have some intuitions about what other people will do and how they will behave in different situations. So if you take people without any behavioral science expertise, will they be able to predict whether studies will replicate or not? So I just want to take a straw poll. How many people think that if you do this exercise where you have people predict, okay, this new study, this new behavioral science finding, does it replicate or not? How many people think that more than half the time that just average people will be able to make that prediction? They're correct more than half the time. Okay. How many people think they'll be correct less than half the time? It's less than chance.
Raise your hand. What's your... Which one did you raise your hand for?
I'm just demonstrating.
Oh, you're demonstrating. Okay, you find out.
Okay, great. I feel like maybe we were split. Yeah? It turns out that regular people can make this prediction more than half the time. That people do have an intuition that seems to be corroborated or proven correct, or at least where the evidence is in favor of them knowing what's going to happen. So I really want to linger on that and kind of draw that out, because this means that the thing that we're all studying, we do have intuitions that are correct, not all the time, but at least some of the time. There's another aspect to this that I find kind of interesting. So, we also know that there are only certain people get to determine what is even the subject of study and what is not the subject of study, and those are the researchers. And one of the reasons that Mistari is here is that to correct this imbalance in who is able to determine what is studied. And the reason I find that important is that when we're asking this question, well, are your intuitions correct? Are they corroborated by what research is done? Well, the research is only certain kinds of research. There are only certain kinds of topics that are even deemed worthy of study. So again, if I go back to the question, like, are you going to be right more than half the time or less than half the time? Well, it also depends on what research you're looking at and who you're asking the question of. Because only certain topics are going to be worthy of investigation. And also, people's intuitions are going to be shaped by where they come from and their context. That also means that certain people are going to be right a greater percentage of the time, and certain people will be wrong a greater percentage of the time through no fault of their own, just because of who they are and where they were born.
On the topic of being right and wrong, I have some funny anecdotes from really popular researchers I'm going to get to in a bit. But just to what you brought up, Patrick, around who gets to make these decisions, right? Like, who are we listening to? Who shapes the direction of thinking, even in terms of what we prioritize and what we don't? And how much of that is actually influenced by intuition versus contextualization versus facts? We've all worked with pretty big international organizations. There's a big influence that the likes of the UN or the World Bank that they play in just the way the things that we care about. Like, how many of us have done research on at least one sustainable developmental goal in our lifetimes? Raise your hand, please. I'm guilty of it too. And these sustainable development goals are designed by a team of people that have worked with other people who have then told them that, okay, this is something that we care about, it's a problem, it's an issue, let's work on these. And unfortunately, even after all of these years of existence, we're still in a pretty shit place, even now, right? Like globally, right? I wonder what is going wrong, because we have a lot more data, we know what issues to focus on, we know what the problems are, we have so many smart people across the world. Why are there so many people who are still poor? Why does poverty still exist? Why are the global poorest becoming poorer by the day? So what is going wrong? I read this article in The Economist recently, which is basically, I don't know what beef this guy has with the World Bank, but it's basically called The World's Poorest Countries Have Experienced a Brutal Decade. Why has development ground to a halt? And essentially in this article, the author just looks at trends over the last decade in terms of what does growth look like? And then he mentions that pretty soon, in a few months, all the leaders from all of these international organizations are going to meet in New York and pat each other on the back and say that, hey, we've eradicated poverty by these many percentage points. But then nobody's actually talking about the poorest people that are out there, including the African continent on which we now find ourselves, where we are also trying to tackle poverty, right? So there's this really nice excerpt of one of my favorite researchers, Esther Duflo. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but her and Abhijit Banerjee have done a lot of groundbreaking research on randomized control trials. Like, they've made randomized control trials popular, right? Like, more popular than fried chicken even. Like, everybody wants to do it. Everybody wants an RCT, we know that. So the idea of an RCT is to be able to generalize, to be able to scale, to be able to speak to impact to a population. So imagine my surprise when I read this. Gonna open this up. Okay, so the author asks Esther Duflo what her ideas are on just the state of development right now. And she says, we can be sure that a lot of what the World Bank does is useless. And let's see why. So I'm just going to read out straight from the article. Washington's institutions have failed to come up with another big idea. So far, their best attempt has been inclusive growth, which covers matters such as jobs, inequality, and sexism, along with more traditional subjects, such as trade and GDP. But it represents more of a wish list than a rescue plan and ultimately lacks rigor. So what do we then do? Like, what is our way out of this? So for their part, developmental economists are refining smaller and smaller interventions rather than trying to come up with one big idea. So what economists like Esther Duflo are now saying is useful is that let's think about context. Let's think about small-scale interventions. Let's not try to do things that are too big, because big ideas just don't exist anymore. So let's take a look, let's make it small, and let's hope that this actually collectively comes together to create something that's useful and meaningful for poverty eradication in the longer run. feels a bit like she's going against her intuition, right? In that the intuitive aspect of this would be to, let's say, come up with an experimental design that actually speaks to policy at a large scale. And what we're now seeing from her is maybe it makes sense to go more granular. Let's think smaller, let's think more contextual, which is honestly beautiful because it's reflective of how our gut feeling or our intuition and our life's work can evolve as well as we learn more and as we get more contextualized and as we integrate and assimilate more knowledge from the spaces in which we work. And I guess that's our best bet in moving forward. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big trends among scientists, so scientists like generalizable knowledge. I'd say that's one of the big goals, especially in the behavioral science, is to generalize. You might say that the intuition of a scientist is to seek knowledge that won't just work in one particular context, but will work in many. Because as a scientist, you want knowledge that can be transported from one setting to another. And yet, what might be most useful for policymakers is not generalizable knowledge per se. Instead, if you want to deliver clean water in Nairobi County, for example, it doesn't really matter so much what's happening in Washington, D.C. What matters is what's happening in Nairobi County. In other words, policy is sort of bound up with context. You need to know that context in order to have an effective policy. So here's a case where the intuitions of scientists who are always seeking generalizable knowledge, in fact, one of the biggest trends in psychology, my home discipline, is these big cross-national projects that are seeking the most generalizable of insights. But those insights end up being a bit generic, and even though they're what the intuition of a scientist might drive them to seek, it might be exactly opposite of what a policymaker is looking for. And in fact, policy is it's a very hard thing to do right. So I mentioned that there are these studies where people where scientists try to see whether it's possible to predict in advance whether a study will replicate. So I was focusing there on social behavioral science studies, studies that focus on the behavior of individuals. Some scientists have also taken this same concept to see, well, if someone is trying to predict what happens with a policy, how accurate are people in making those predictions? So do their predictions match what actually happens if you look at what happened in the rollout of a specific policy? So I want to pause here. I may be giving away the game of what happens by the way I set up the issues, but I just want you to raise your hand again. How many people think that when normal average people were asked to make these predictions about the success of policy, how many people think they were right more than half the time? Raise your hand if you think so. Okay. So this is the setup. People are given a set of policies and programs, and they're asked, these are normal people without any policy expertise. How many people think that these normal average people were correct about the outcomes of policy more than half the time? Okay. How many people think it was less than half the time? It was less than half the time. Now I'm going to ask another follow-up question. So these researchers did the same exercise with both scientists and regular people. So I just asked you about regular people. So if we think about scientists, the experts, how many people think that scientists were correct about the outcomes of policy more than half the time? How many people think they were right less than half the time? It was less than half the time. Okay, one more follow-up question. How many people think that these scientists were more accurate than regular people? How many people think that they were more accurate or were just about as accurate as regular people? They were as accurate. There was no advantage to being a scientist. So let me just emphasize these results again because they're kind of stunning. Okay, so we have these policies, and normal people are not very accurate in predicting what's going to work. But also, scientists are not very accurate, and they're just as accurate as normal people. Okay, that should be surprising. I hope that's surprising. Yes, Dan. We don't know yet, but it's not scientists. Maybe if you have policy expertise, maybe that's a separate type of expertise. That would be my intuition. But I don't know. Yeah.
I have a question. So were these normal people, were the policies that they were asked to, opine on the accuracies of, did they actually, were they maybe part of the context in which the policies were implemented in?
No.
Okay, so they're just random people saying X policy has taken place, was implemented in Y location. You are from Z place, no
Correct.
relation to it. Tell me whether it's accurate or not.
Correct. That's a really excellent question. That would be another excellent follow-up. And in fact, a few economists have done this in the context of cash transfer RCTs. So the setup is we have these cash transfer RCTs now, where people are given cash, and the economists measure all sorts of things about them, well-being, and their household consumption, and all sorts of things. Some economists have asked, well, if you ask people who are about to receive these cash transfer RCTs, or maybe are from the same context, are they able to predict what's going to happen once someone from that context receives that cash? And they are. They're pretty accurate. Because just like I was talking about with how normal people in their everyday lives have to predict all the time how others are going to behave, which maybe means that normal people have some expertise about how other people behave. But in the same way, if you're from Nairobi County and you're trying to get some sense of how cash, if given to you or your neighbor, would affect your lives, like maybe you have some expertise in that because you're forced to deal with that context all the time. So here's another example where we have two sets of intuitions. We have, or multiple sets of intuitions. We have the intuitions of the supposed experts. We have the intuitions of normal people who are not necessarily part of the context, and the intuitions of people within the context. And it seems like the intuitions of people within the context are pretty accurate, at least for predicting, how changes in their context will affect their own lives and the lives of other people. So I want to go back to that question again of whose intuition are we trusting? Who gets the right to say my intuition matters in this particular setting? I think that's a really key question.
Yeah, and when we're thinking about whose intuition we're listening to, let's talk a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, please, because that's where it becomes really important in just understanding what we think we need to intuitively do. And how does collective wisdom almost come together to then ensure that tension between sort of a global north prepping versus a global south wisdom almost comes together to create cohesion. So perhaps, Stan, I'm going to put you on the spot a bit there. What has been your experience in kind of going with established DEI norms and techniques versus what your intuition tells you about what you should be doing for Busara? Would you like the mic? Yeah.
I said I love the spot. I think that maybe the thing to understand for most people here is that DEI, even as a concept, is a global north kind of thinking, and so a lot of the research and a lot of the policies and practices, what are called best practices, do come from that lens. I think for me, my experience has taught me that we have to really think differently about what DEI means for the global south. For example, there was this kind of like big wave or this big movement around Black Lives Matter in America, and that's really important, but that's also kind of like very contextual, and it does not actually translate for the spaces that we work in. And for me, what I found that really starts to get to the heart of DEI in the global south is this perspective around giving voice to people who don't usually get voice. And that to me has been the most impactful ways that Busara has started to engage with DEI. It's really finding the folks in the organization who don't have voice or traditionally don't have voice but should, and really uplifting those voices. For example, you talk to Marika, who teaches a course at University of Chicago, and then she teaches it together with Jennifer, and then it's questionable who the students benefit from hearing from. So that's a question for Marika to answer. I'll give her.
Only give answers confidentially.
Yes, confidentially speaking. So bringing Jennifer, who is not someone that students from Chicago are used to hearing from, really adds a lot of wealth to the students' perspective. So, and again, the same here in our staff, but also within our communities that we work with is like, can we find ways to give those people who are generally not having voice to actually become more of like active participants? So that's the way I kind of like frame it within my mind. Are we perfect at it? No. Are we making progress? Yes. So progress beats perfect from my perspective. You can clap.
So I don't know if people here know this about me, but in my former career, actually I was a researcher of DEI interventions. So this is an area that I know something about, at least what a certain area of the research does. I found Stanley's reflection really interesting because, surprise, surprise, this is another area where the way the research is constructed and framed and investigated is a little bit different from many people's experiences. So in that little sub-area that I used to be an active participant in, one of the big ideas from the past 20 years regards the idea of unintended bias. The idea is there are plenty of well-meaning people who don't always live up to their values and therefore slip up. And this could have implications for DEI issues, who gets promoted, who gets recruited, and so on. Undoubtedly, this is true. Everybody's imperfect. People make mistakes. So there's a certain way in which this idea, it just has to be true, and it couldn't possibly be wrong. But some people in this area have gone a step further to claim that this is the primary reason why organizations don't always have employees that reflect the diversity of the settings that they're in, and make this sort of the primary issue within DEI, this issue of unintended bias. There is a good reason for that, and it has a lot to do with the history in the United States, where a lot of this research has taken place. And that is that over time, since the 60s, people's attitudes, or what they report to people who measure public opinion about diversity issues, have gotten very, very positive. But the outcomes for, say, African Americans in the United States haven't always changed with the same pace. So this is the kind of observation that's led researchers like, well, I used to be, to focus on this issue of unintended bias. The idea is, well, if people are saying one thing in opinions but doing another thing, maybe they're lying, or maybe there's something going on inside them that leads them to not live up to their values. So again, I just want to emphasize, it's undoubtedly true that people do not live up to their values all the time. It just has to be true. But is it the case that this is the major issue for DEI, especially in a place like Busara? And my conclusion from working in this area is no, that's not the primary issue. I used to give some of these workshops that focused on unintended bias, and let me tell you, like, there's just I just encountered so many issues that had nothing to do with unintended bias, like diversity workshops being used as sort of a political tool to provide public cover for because like an organization was undergoing a lawsuit. Yes, that did happen to me. Diversity workshops also being used as a way to deflect from discussions about like just general workplace issues, like whether people are being paid enough. Yes, that also did happen to me. I was called in as the diversity consultant in what I later learned was basically a political move by the administration. These are some of the reasons that led me to believe that, you know, this focus in what's happening in the research, it made sense from a certain perspective, especially from the perspective of an American, who are the primary people doing this research. Did it actually reflect the way that diversity initiatives play out in organizations, especially outside the US? I don't think so. So I just want to highlight again, there's this difference between the intuitions of researchers like I was, and people's realities in these organizations and their intuitions. Certain initiatives were prioritized, or have been prioritized in the United States over things like what Stanley was talking about. Did you have a reflection, Stan?
Yeah, maybe a follow-up reflection based on what you've just shared about is unintentional bias, or maybe using a different word, but what did you call it?
Unintentional bias, yeah.
Unintentional bias. Is that the main issue that we face at Busara, for example? No, it is present, but it's not the main one. The main one, at least again from my perspective and I guess intuition, is more structural. So that's why, for example, we wouldn't host a series of DEI workshops, but actually most of our DEI work is structural. So if you read our approach to DEI as Busara, it's really looking at the quiet processes and structures that cause DEI issues and addressing those. They are not very loud, they are not very open, but they are systemic, and in addressing those first, then it starts to kind of like address some of the more major issues that aren't always vocal. For example, you've spoken about when you were invited for the to talk about DEI, but it was really a cover for the unequal pay. So for us, we just do the equal pay policy, and so that's how we tend to kind of like approach it. Though now we are maybe thinking about becoming a bit more vocal about it, more and more open about it. But that's kind of like the approach that Busara as an organization takes to DEI.
Thanks, Dan. So unintended bias then kind of takes my mind to this concept of belief perseverance, right? Belief perseverance is essentially a phenomena, it's actually a behavioral phenomena, in which you tend to hold a certain belief about something, and because of that belief, you're going to reach a certain conclusion. And it has been proven that even if you are given evidence of contradictory belief, like strong, hard evidence of contradictory belief, you still tend to stick to your initial opinion based on the previous belief that you had. So an example of this is a study where there were two groups, and one group was told that they were being judged a certain way by a panel, and the other group was not told that they were judged in any way. There was literally no priming in terms of how they perceived that group. And then both these groups were asked to rate the panel on whether they thought they were empathetic or not empathetic. The group that was told or primed to believe that they were being judged by the panel rated the panel as being not empathetic. Versus the group that did not receive that priming, they were either neutral or they tended to rate them as empathetic. Now, the researchers come in and they tell these two groups, sorry, I actually made a mistake. They did not judge you or score you in any way. My mistake. Do you want to rate them again? So the group that now has this new evidence or information that they were actually not judged or scored still decided to rate the panel as not empathetic, whereas the other group had the same consistent responses. And that is, I guess, where it does flow into the idea of unintentional bias still, right? So you might be incredibly well-intentioned, and still because of a lot of the beliefs that we hold, we might be primed to think and perceive things in a certain way. And that kind of brings to the question, when should you be trusting your gut? And I have this really fun excerpt. So Danny Kahneman, he's pretty popular, won the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. You might know him as the author of Thinking Fast and Slow, has been a psychologist for a very long time. So this is an excerpt from this thing called an adversarial debate that he started. And an adversarial debate, the entire idea is to basically deviate from angry science. Angry science is when scientists don't agree and they have contradictory data or contradictory beliefs and evidence about a phenomena. And he started this concept called adversarial debates to essentially bring these contradictory sort of perceptions or evidence together to hold a healthy debate to then agree to disagree, which is not always our best. Like, that's not a quality that we all always administer, but let's see what Danny Kahneman has to say about his own work, which has come as a result of one of these adversarial debates that he held. So he says, I will now share a personal experience of belief perseverance that I cannot shake. 10 years ago, when I was young and foolish, I published Thinking Fast and Slow. An important chapter in that book was concerned with behavioral priming. For example, the famous study which people who have been made to think of old age walk more slowly than they normally would. I felt at the time that the evidence was important to my view, and I credited the author of that particular study, John Berg, with being a significant influence on my work. The spectacular results that I described in that chapter were mentioned in most of my reviews and came up more often than anything in the letters that I got about the book. I was completely committed to believing those findings, and in arguing about them, I made what I thought was a good point about science. You are not allowed to believe only results that seem plausible to you. That's something that he holds as a very strong ideology. Well, I was wrong, at least in that case. The studies of behavioral priming that I had cited in the chapter were largely discredited in the famous replication crisis of psychology. And essentially what happened after that was he had to redact that entire chapter from the book, and he had to take back a lot of the things that he said. And he claims that he felt pretty foolish. But in hindsight, on reflecting on this a bit more, he says that he still holds the same beliefs, that if you were to essentially follow behavioral priming, the results would still be consistent despite the very public sort of discrediting of the work that he presented out there. So maybe because we're not perfect, we are always going to exhibit some form of unintentional bias, and maybe we should not always trust our gut. What do you think, Patrick?
Yeah, this example with Danny Kahneman is really interesting. Partly because some of the studies that he referenced in this chapter of his most famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow, were some of the very studies that were presented to everyday people, like I mentioned at the beginning of the session, as to whether if you did the study again, would you get the same results? And as I told you, everyday people, you don't have to be a scientist to do this, were able to predict at above 50% accuracy as to whether those studies would get the same results. And let me give you a taste of the type of study that Danny Kahneman was talking about in this chapter. In one of these studies, one of the most famous ones, college students from the United States were asked to unscramble sentences. The sentences might say something like, we are at Terra Mistari. They fit together in a sentence. But one of the words did not. One of the words did not make sense. And so they were unscrambling a bunch of these sentences. And there was always this one word that did not fit in the sentence. And for half the participants, that word indicated things related to old age. So one of the words in this study wouldn't make sense if you're in the United States, but the word is Florida. And the reason for it is that in the United States, a lot of people, when they retire, they're over 65 years of age, they move to Florida. And people in the United States know this. It only works if you're from the United States. But some of the others might work for people outside the United States. It might be things like memory or cane or whatever. So for half the participants, that one word that does not fit in the sentence, it's related to old age. And for half the participants, it's related to not much at all. So the hypothesis that these researchers were trying to test is that if people are thinking about old age because the sentences were unscrambled, when they walked down the hall after doing this task, they would walk slower. So from a certain standpoint, from a certain research tradition that I was even a part of when I was getting my training, this seemed like something that was plausible. Like if you asked the scientists, if you asked them to think about what their gut feeling said, they would say, yeah, this would work. But again, to normal people, if you're just like unscrambling a bunch of sentences and you get some random words, like what is that going to have to do with whether you walk fast or slow? It doesn't make sense. But even someone as famous as Danny Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner, was so convinced because of belief perseverance, because of, there's another related idea called confirmation bias, which means you look at the evidence that only confirms what you think and you just say, oh, that other evidence, that's all crap. So because of these different things, even someone as famous and smart as Danny Kahneman thought that this result was plausible. So plausible that in his book, he even said that you have no choice but to accept the results. Even if you think that this is implausible, this is just what the evidence says. And it turns out that he was completely wrong. So this is another case where context provides some valuable information that expertise does not. And it's not to say that expertise is not helpful, but that contextual information, that contextual knowledge, that is valid. And it does lead people to have intuitions that aren't right all the time, but are right some of the time. Now, there's one other aspect of this instant that I find very interesting, and that has to do with the other issue that Anushka was hinting at, which is when you should not trust your gut. Because part of the reason that Danny Kahneman was proven wrong, that he did actually admit on a comment on a blog post that maybe he shouldn't have been so confident. So even though he wasn't totally convinced, at least he was willing to accept that he was partially wrong. The whole reason that happened at all has to do with something that's special about the way science operates, which is this concept of, it's called organized skepticism. So the sociologists who have studied science have noted some features about science that are kind of unusual relative to other things that people do. And this is one of them, which is that there are certain structures in science that force you to ask yourself, are you actually right? And sometimes it's very forceful. So one of these structures is peer review. If you try to publish a paper, a bunch of people that they might even be your friends, that's happened to me, are going to tear your paper apart and say, like, what the hell are you doing? This is so crap. And you're forced to work through that organized skepticism. And that process of working through that skepticism, of questioning your gut, that's part of what makes scientific findings credible. That's part of what's special about the structure that we're calling science. Because it forces you to really confront the flaws in what you're doing, and whether you like it or not, whether it feels nice or not. I've had reviews that have made me like, get up in anger and just like take a walk. It can be really unpleasant to be confronted with things that you did wrong. And peer reviewers, they're not always doing it in a nice way. But the good thing about that is that in being forced to confront the places where you might be wrong, where your intuition or your gut feeling is off, that makes the finished result that survives that process all the more credible and all the more trustworthy. So I've just gone on about how, your gut can be useful, but here's a case where maybe trusting your gut isn't always the right thing. So there is this balance between trusting your gut and also questioning it and trying to confront the places where your intuition might be off.
Yeah, and the term for that now that's actually being researched a lot as a very important non-cognitive skill is intellectual humility, right? So there's a lot of studies right now that are exploring the concept of intellectual humility and how important that is just in the process of knowledge generation and also in just meaning making and gaining perspectives of the world around you. So we have a question for you now. We'd like you to think about a time when you trusted your gut and it really paid off, and also think about a time when you trusted your gut and it went in, the outcome was actually the opposite of what you expected, And you thought to yourself, you know what, I should have possibly done some more research on this or listened to someone else and perhaps not trusted my gut over there. And what we're going to do in this is we're going to turn to a partner next to us, and one person is going to share about a time to the partner when they trusted their gut and it paid off, and the other person is going to share the opposite of them trusting their gut and not paying off at all. And then we'll come back together as a group and take some responses and share. Turn to the person to your left.
So I turn left and then she turns
And
left.
then she also, and then you turn left. No, you also turn left. Well, we have about 5 minutes, and then we can take some responses, take some ideas on how we can present our work.
Like a joint paper that we had on a project where we took comments
Yeah, I think it's cool.
I'm glad I completely removed. I went with my gut and I didn't speak about the philosophy. My God, that's like I'm like that's a tangent where I get loopy. Like I get so loopy, and I think it paid off. That's me.
We have plenty to talk about.
Yeah, for sure. There's absolutely no need to bring in like abstract ideas about powers and entity now. Don't need it.
I know, I think that too.
Jennifer Nevada, deep in
Yeah, we're taking the task very seriously.
really thinking about it.
What should we do with this?
Or give it like maybe another minute.
Give it another time, I think. We have those
I don't know, I'm not sure. Let me check it. Okay, we can take a few responses.
Technically, you leave like 10 minutes at the end for their own reflections, right? And then
Okay, yeah, we can wrap up in the next 3 or 5, yeah.
I feel like the associated process like this decision of
will you ask them questions to your input? Because maybe they have.
Oh, yeah. So this is when we open up the discussion and then we ask for questions and then we finish.
value and value. I don't know if you feel like that. I often ask myself like,
Honestly, what was in the session? Why the session? I don't think I understood anything. Because I couldn't concentrate.
Do you want me to just?
No, it's fine. Let them talk. It was so chaotic and I was so excited about that session, but it was just like I couldn't see the slides from where I was seated on the ground. And then when we were discussing, I couldn't like hear people over all of them. Like my brain just couldn't. So I just shut down and I was a bit sad. Yeah.
Well, the big takeaways were context is not one thing. You're a part of the context.
Okay, got it.
There are multiple contexts that can be happening at the same time. And to understand that, to unravel those contexts, you might need someone who's in the multiple contexts for a period of time to unpick the different dynamics that might be happening.
Shall we bring people back?
Yeah.
Let's wrap it up. All right.
that's all you have.
Okay. So we're gonna to take some responses from you guys. Maybe share something interesting you heard from your partner on a time that you trusted your gut and it really paid off, and a time that you trusted your gut and you really wish you didn't. So any volunteers, any takers to share with the group? Yes.
Hi guys, I'm Baraza. So I'm sharing an insight from Suleiman. So Suleiman just mentioned that I just mentioned that growing up is always like trusted his work. Like you always feel like there's no need to like do a second reading, like a proofreading. Until recently, when he was tasked with some data task. It was his first time doing this. So I was before delivery, like he wrote the codes and stuff, and the codes were running. But his instinct was like, no, I know you promised Jennifer that you will deliver this before going on leave, but just share the data. And part of it was like, no, just give it a second thought, give it a second eye. And actually, like he had done some erroneous things, which would have really affected the quality of the work. And I think up to now is something that I think is a skill that he has to do, like counter checking, not believing that he knows what is right here.
Great, so that's a great example of when Sule trusted his gut and it paid off. Does somebody want to share about a time they trusted their gut and it did not pay off? Yes.
Yeah, this is my experience. Coming to Nairobi this time around, I didn't buy health insurance. Previously, I had always bought travel insurance. But this time around, I was like, hey, no need. I was going to waste my money. And then, unfortunately, this is the period I had all the episodes that I could have, gotten compensations. So the health insurance cost less than $20, and I could have, gotten about $1,500. My flight got delayed, my bag got missing, it had to be sent to me the other day. So yeah, I just looked at it, I was like, I should have actually bought it because I've always bought it, but then I thought this time around I would just do it.
Isn't that always the way it works?
Yeah, so the next time we're trying to skip over the travel insurance, we're going to remember Mo's experience, yes, and not do that. All right. That brings us to the end of the session. Thank you so much for participating. We're going to, thank you. We'd love to invite in any questions that you may have for Patrick or me, and anything that you want to maybe share to the whole group, any takeaways, any more questions about this.
Sure.
Oh, well, I was not. See, this is a time when my gut was completely.
Yeah, the session's been really great. Thank you guys so much. I feel like my takeaway is that I should always trust my gut, but assume that I'm wrong most of the time anyways, or be open to being wrong, and that feels like the clear takeaway for me. Intellectual humility. Exactly.
Hi, so great session, loved it, and Patrick, Anushka, awesome job hosting it and having this conversation. Super informal, and I think we really learned a lot. So I have questions, but I will ask only one, and maybe I can follow up with the others later, because of course. But so there is this idea of, I think context matters, and I think what I'm referring to here is when people in the context, like in policy context, whether from that policy context, they will maybe predict maybe the success of that policy, whatever it is, right, or the outcomes of it, or whether it would work or not effectively. To a better extent relative to maybe actual scientists or people not from that context. But there is this idea of, which is very valid, and therefore I think a lot of this maybe policy making should be participatory in its approach and its method. But there is this idea of institutional knowledge as well, like science in general. Like we, of course, to a certain degree of confidence or whatever it is, we know what works in some occasions. We know that X solves Y problem or has solved Y problem on A, B, C, D, E, F, G occasion. So how do you then balance specifically in the policy making process? How do you then balance this idea of institutional knowledge, saying we as an institution of whatever it is, we know that this works, but maybe we should adopt a certain degree of intellectual humility and then maybe make the policy making process more participatory. So how do you find that middle ground in the policy making process?
Well, I have to say first that I'm not an expert in this. So I'm just going to give you some reflections, and you take you take from them what you will. So my opinion is that any individual person is fallible. But what you're hoping is that the structures that we build within Busara, but also structures in science, in the policymaking process, that those structures are created in such a way that the final output is trustworthy. That goes back to the idea of organized skepticism that I mentioned. This is one of those structures that I think works well for certain kinds of science. Science has done a lot of pretty amazing things. I've talked about some of the flaws too, but this structure of organized skepticism, where you have many different ways in which individual scientists are questioned and they're forced to think, well, is this really true? And that's something that does increase the trustworthiness of knowledge. In the context of policy, what you're hoping is that the government structures, the government agencies, or something about the process through which policymaking happens, create similar kinds of structures where the input of many different people are considered, are forced to be considered because of the incentives that are built into the process, and that's the thing that produces the effective policy. Obviously, it doesn't work all the time, but that's the task of policymakers to begin with, and the people who want to have input into the policy process. All of us are trying to figure out what are those structures that create trustworthiness, whether it's organized skepticism or something else, and are those structures in place? So I would put the burden of being right not on any one individual, but on those structures and on the people who are ensuring that those structures function effectively.
I want to add something. I'm probably a bit more cynical than you are, Patrick. Honestly, I don't think there's any solution to that, right? Like, we'd all be out of a job if problems didn't exist. And institutions exist because we borrow from the good things in each other and we borrow from the bad as well. And there's a purpose to our existence because the bad exists. So I don't know if there is honestly a possible future in which everything's perfect. And I think that's kind of what makes life interesting a bit, but I'm not trying to gloss over the actual real issues that exist. But to your question, Shalin, I think we just need to talk to each other a bit more. I feel like people and institutions in positions of power make decisions independently more often than not, and that's where work that we do at Busara becomes so important, because we bring people together. And it's important that we talk to each other, it's important that we demonstrate care and intent in the way that we operate, and are also willing to accept when something fails, and it's okay to fail as well, right? Like, I don't think we publicly also think it's okay to fail. So there's a lot of things that need to change, but in terms of policy, like, we're not even sure a democracy works. So where do we then go from there? The way our governments are set up is probably not great either. So there's a lot that goes on. It's very interconnected. There were some questions here, or people?
Maybe a question. To what extent then should we trust our instinct? Can you say it's a 50-50, or maybe we rely on past experience, or just wing it and see where it goes?
Just a reflection on that question. That's great for a takeaway. So one point that I hope you get from this is that certain people are systematically told that their instincts are not trustworthy. And that goes back to the points I was making earlier about how research is done in a certain place, and the people who call themselves experts are not really experts on everything, certainly not your life. So I think it's quite dangerous to tell someone, especially someone who has been told their entire life that their instincts are not trustworthy, that, oh, you shouldn't trust your gut. But the counterbalance to that is that there are many useful times when you should question your gut. And so I liked Rowan's suggestion that you should have the confidence to trust your gut, but also the self-awareness to question it, and the openness or intellectual humility to admit that, okay, my gut was not right here, and here's why. So that's the balance that I would suggest.
Okay. Oh, sorry, Mariah.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for this session. And in the spirit of Mistari, I want to draw some connections because we heard a lot about intuition and trusting your gut and so on. In the previous session, we spoke about knowledge systems, epistemologies, belief systems, and then this morning we heard from Yatin Pandya that space can change belief system. The toilet part is really a profound version of that. And I just kind of wanted to throw that out as a way of connecting things, saying that you can actually change belief systems if you create a space that allows you to do that. And I think that was a very profound thing for researchers to think about, which is what is the space that we're creating akin to the toilet part that actually then helps people to adjust their really deeply held beliefs and belief systems and kind of gut reactions to a particular situation. And if we still have time, I would love to hear from Naomi, who had in her session this question, what role does education play in all of this and how we actually perceive the world and believe it and what intuition we also develop. So I don't know if I'm passing on the baton without any time, but I wanted to at least try. Thank you.
Julia decides.
Yes. Last comment.
Sure. Coming off of the session that we had, which was really interesting, where we had different people from very different educational backgrounds talking about their experience, and realized even a lot of assumptions that we had, assuming if you came from this background, this is what your experience was. And I think one of the reflections from that session was we work together with these people, and sometimes you've never even learned the journey. We see them for who they are now, but we don't know what got them to this extent. So we don't know where is this coming from. Is there a background that is actually influencing how this person's approach to something is? And we picked out some differences and similarities in terms of how do I approach problems, how do I approach new knowledge, how do I approach new people, and that seemed to be different from different perspectives. So I think from that and what Marika you said about beliefs is also challenging our own beliefs and thinking, are they actually factual? Do I know enough about this to say these are my beliefs about this? Yeah, so I think from our session that was what I picked out from it. Julia was in a session. I would also, this is throwing people under. Yeah, Julia, perhaps you could also share a comment.
Yeah, and close the session because everyone is hungry. No, I agree. I think this two sessions actually connected intuition to knowledge, right? And I think this is the perfect combination where we constantly question our intuition with rationality. So thank you. A big warm applause from Patrick and Anushka. Thank you so much. It's been amazing. Super great. Two more announcements for the break. You have colors and you're part of a cohort. So make sure that during the break you connect with your cohort and talk to them for at least 10 minutes. You don't need to stick with them the whole time, but at least so that you know each other. And then I have another clue for the treasure hunt. That's also very important. The book means reflect. 1 page from the answer above, multiplied twice. Look closely now, and you will see me judging you. I will repeat. The book means reflect. 1 page from the answer above, multiplied twice. Look closely now, and you will see me judging you. Okay, thank you so much. See you.
I don't think we even got it in the last one.